everything works, but we're still hardcoding things. All we did was moving the values from this file into another file. So what's the catch? When working on a complex Nuxt project, and even more so when doing it as part of a team, there's a good chance you're also dealing with different environments. You might have an int environment, QA environment, pre-live, live, CI, and so on. At this point, hardcoding URLs like this is a no-no. It's all fine on your personal projects, but when different people and environments are involved, this kind of things need to be defined in your Nuxt config and env files. Here's how. The first thing we need to do is give this a name. This is the URL of our Nuxt app, so app URL seems like a good name for it. The second thing we need to do is determine if this app URL can be a publicly accessible value or a private one. Is there any harm in people knowing our Nuxt app URL? Well, not really, so we'll go with public. Once we know the name and the visibility, we can open our Nuxt config file, add a key called runtime config, and if we're dealing with a public variable, which we are, we'll add a public key, which will be an object containing our variable, so app URL, and we'll set this to http localhost 3000. Now to access this config variable, we can go back to our use API fetch composable, go here and say const config equals use runtime config, and then here we'll do config public app URL. Let's go in the browser. I am authenticated, and if that refer header has the correct value, I can do a full page refresh and I'm still authenticated, which means our config variable is properly set. Scrolling down, we have another hardcoded value, so we'll follow the same process. We'll give it a name. This is the Laravel API URL, so I'll call it API URL. And no, there is no harm in someone knowing its value, so it will be public as well. Let's go ahead and grab the value. Go to our Nuxt config, add API URL, paste it in, go back to our composable and use config public API URL. I'll save, go in the browser, refresh, log out, log in. Everything is still working, which means this is correct. You might say, okay, everything works, but we're still hardcoding things. All we did was moving the values from this file into another file. So what's the catch? Well, the configuration values in our Nuxt config file can be overwritten by variables defined in our env file. But we don't have an env file, so let's create it. Now, to override config variables defined in our Nuxt config, we need to follow a specific format. For public variables, we need to add the Nuxt prefix, then public, and then the name of the config variable in all caps with underscores to separate keys and case changes. So for app URL, we'll have Nuxt public app underscore URL, and we'll set this to http localhost 3000. Then for API URL, we'll do Nuxt public API URL. And we'll set this to localhost 8000. Let's go ahead and change these. I'll set some random gibberish. Save. Go in the browser, refresh, and everything is still working. So I can log in again, I can log out, everything is fine. Now you can leave these here as defaults, so I can just undo and use the env file to override these. So for QA, you'll have something like QA myapp.com, and here you'll have QA API myapp.com. You get the point. Now, to be honest, I don't really like this automatically replacement of config variables. It feels a bit too magical for me. What I usually like to do is go here and access the environment variables directly. We can do process, env, and then the variable name. And of course, set the fallback. I'll do the same for API URL, and here we'll have API URL. This way I know exactly where these values are coming from. And of course, this also means we no longer need to stick to this specific format. We can just have API URL and app URL. So I can go here, drop all these. I'll grab these two values because I want to test it. I'll go here, paste them in, and then write some gibberish here. Then I'll go in the browser, refresh, and everything should still be working, which it is. So yeah, do it however you like it. This is my preferred way to do it. A while back, I mentioned that config variables can also be private. Imagine you're communicating with some service using an API key, payments provider, email marketing tool, authentication provider, and so on. Anything requiring a secret key. You wouldn't want people to be able to access that. So for example, if we were to go to our public config and say payment API key, super sensitive. If I am to go to my browser, let's put these back in. If I am to go to my browser, I can refresh, go to the console and do __Nuxt. And if I open this object, I see we have this config, and then we have public, and then I can steal your payment API key. So this kind of thing shouldn't be in our public config. To make it secret, all you need to do is move it outside. So now this can only be accessed server-side. For example, if we go to our, let's say we'll create like a API endpoint, we can go here and say API/test.ts. We can do export default define event handler. Here we can access our config, so we'll do const config, use runtime config, and we can return an object with API key config payment API key. And now if we go in the browser and access localhost/API/test, here is our API key. But if we are to grab this and go to, let's say, our default layout file, let's paste it in and output the contents of it here. Let's go to localhost 3000. We can only see the public config variables. But if we are to go to our API endpoint and return the entire config, I'll refresh, we have everything here. So private config variables are only available on the server. They cannot be accessed publicly, unless of course you do something dumb like putting them in a JSON response. To override private config variables using the env file, we follow the same format, except we drop the public word. So this is gone. Here we'll have payment API key and hello from .env. Now if we go in the browser, refresh, we have a new value. And that was it. That's how you define config variables in Nuxt 3. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share it, subscribe, click the bell button, all that good stuff. Bye!